Today's presentation will be led by Letitia Stevenson from right here out of Region 10, and we're excited for her to walk us through the information. Our session topic is understanding behavior intervention plans, and with that, I'll turn it over to Letitia.
Thank you. All
Thank
right, let me go ahead and share my screen. Everyone should be able to see it without any issues. Um, like she said, my name is Letitia Stevenson, and we're going to be talking about behavior intervention plans or BIPs. But honestly, we're going to talk about a little bit more than that because there are some steps in the process that have to happen before we get to a BIP most of the time. So let me go ahead and get that started. This is my information. I am the school psychology consultant at Region 10. Prior to being at Region 10, I was working in districts, completing evaluations, including functional behavioral assessments, and helping the districts write behavior intervention plans. I also did counseling as a related service, consultation, so many other wonderful, wonderful tasks as a school psychologist. So I have a pretty broad skill set. And one of the things that I am most passionate about is making sure that school districts and campuses are building relationships with their families to make sure that we are meeting all of the needs of our students in Region 10. So, like I said earlier, we're going to talk about a little bit more than a behavior intervention plan or a BIP. But we are going to dive a little bit for just a moment into the ABCs of special education. If you have been around in the special education world for a while, maybe your child's a little bit older, maybe you have multiple children, perhaps you were a special education student yourself, you quickly learn that there's a lot of new phrases and words and almost its own language when we're talking about special education. And so when you go to a meeting for your child, they'll call it an ARD or ARD meeting. We're going to talk about an IEP, which is an individualized education program. We're going to talk about the FIE that was conducted, which is that evaluation, full and individual evaluation. And so a BIP and an FBA are just another part of the SPED ABCs. And we're going to define what an FBA is and what a BIP is. They go hand in hand. We're going to talk about the purpose of both of those things, and we'll talk about your role as a parent when it comes to FBAs, BIPs, and then further on, talking about the progress that we would like to see our students make on the behavior goals that we create as a team. If you have questions, I can answer them, especially towards the end, or you can reach out to me. I do need to preface this that every district has their own procedures in place, and not every district has the same staff members completing the FBAs and the BIPs. And so, if there are unique characteristics within your district that are a little bit different than maybe some of the things that I say, it's not that your district's doing something wrong. It may just be that they are utilizing resources that they have available that maybe other districts don't have. So some of our really big districts, they have a lot more staff than our smaller districts. And so they are making sure that their staff is trained appropriately to meet the needs of their students. And sometimes that means they're going to get training on how to complete FBAs and BIPs. I also can't go into specifics on your case because there are so many different components that come into play when we're talking about behavior and when we're talking about IEPs and evaluations. And that is not my role here at Region 10 to go case by case like that. I can answer general questions, but when it's very specific, I do not feel comfortable answering those questions because I would want to know the full scope of your students' plan and evaluation and situation. So just want to put a caveat out there because sometimes I get some questions and I feel so awful when I say, oh, I can't answer that question. I don't know the situation. And it would take a lot more time and resources and effort for us to come together to talk about those things. And I want you to be able to build that relationship with your team on your campus to meet those needs. But I do have some guiding questions I can always give you. Okay. The first thing we're going to talk about are those FBAs, or functional behavioral assessments. This is a really important process that we undertake for students who have IEPs, who are demonstrating behaviors that are interfering with their learning or the learning of others. Oftentimes, they can be pretty challenging behaviors. And so we have tried other interventions and strategies, and they haven't really addressed the behavior like we would expect or would hope. And so our next line of defense is to complete a functional behavioral assessment. This is a deeper dive into looking at the behavior, looking at the environment, looking at the situations surrounding the behaviors to figure out why is our student engaging in that behavior and how can we prevent that behavior from happening again, which can include accommodations. It can include positive strategies that we want to use, and it can also include direct instruction with the student to help them build a new skill that they may not have, which is causing those behaviors. This is considered an evaluation. So that means that most districts are going to require a consent form to be signed, and you would receive informed consent, and you will be notified of your rights as a parent with a student who is receiving special education supports and services. There are also other instances where an FBA could be completed. This can happen if a child also has a 504 plan, and some districts have decided to adopt the practice for our students who are in general education and receiving interventions through the intervention tiered system that they have on their campus prior to getting to that referral. We want to make sure that we are addressing the needs of all of our students, even leading up to a special education referral. And so some districts have adopted a way to look at why behaviors are happening and how can we address those needs through a general education FBA. Not all districts, it's not required in gen ed necessarily. It's required that they address those behaviors, but the FBA is not a required component of general education. It is with special education, 100%. And that is usually because we have already provided a lot of really great support through that IEP, and it's just not enough to meet the needs of those kiddos. So then we have to be very strategic in how we're addressing those needs and evaluating for those needs. FBAs are not a magic wand to tell us this is the exact fix for the behavior, and it's going to allow my child to be able to participate in the learning environment. I wish it was a magic wand. A BIP, behavior intervention plan, is also not a magic wand. I wish it were, but it's not. It is a component of the IEP and of that evaluation that will allow us to make good decisions for our students going forward who are struggling with challenging behaviors. Like I said earlier, your consent does need to be obtained from you, which means your district, your team on your campus for your student should be meeting to discuss the behavioral concerns with you ahead of time and informing you, hey, these are all the things that we've done, and we are still not able to quite crack the code on what's happening with your student and why they're engaging in these behaviors. So we need to go one step further and do an FBA. It is one of the most specific evaluations that we do in special education simply because we are trying to really hone in on behavior. This type of evaluation is really looking at the why. Why is behavior happening? Why is the student struggling with being able to be around peers? Why are they struggling with being able to follow instructions? Why are they having difficulty regulating their emotions? An FBA is meant to help us answer that question and then identify the strategies and interventions that can help the student move beyond those challenging behaviors to access the classroom and the learning environment and to be with their peers. It is also possible that multiple FBAs will need to be completed for a student, usually not one after the other, because usually we do an FBA we determine what the function or why of the behavior is, and then we address those behaviors through that behavior intervention plan. But sometimes behaviors change, new behaviors come up, and it throws the art committee for a loop. And we ask each other, what has happened? What is this new behavior telling us? So sometimes when that happens, we may need to do another FBA. This could be in a year, in 3 years, whenever a new behavior pops up, or when there's a behavior that perhaps was there before and then we improved it and it's coming back around again. We're suddenly seeing that behavior happen again. Or if we've conducted the FBA and we determined what we thought that the function was and we're addressing the needs and it's still not quite working, we may need to go back to the drawing board to see what did we miss. And sometimes what we miss could be something related to the environment at school. It could be something related to the student's health. It could be something related to things going on outside of school. There are so many different components and aspects of life that impact a child's behavior and emotionality that sometimes we have to go back to the drawing board, especially for kiddos who have some pretty complex needs. All right. So the purpose of that FBA is, again, trying to figure out why that behavior is happening. And what are they trying to get or avoid when they are engaging in that behavior? My favorite example of this happens a lot with our younger kiddos who are really struggling with reading. I have had so many students who would leave the classroom or act out in the classroom to avoid reading in front of their peers. And this is often because they're struggling with reading. Maybe they can't read yet. Maybe they aren't reading fluently. Maybe they get really anxious or nervous to read in front of their peers. And so maybe they would rather run out of the classroom or engage in behavior we don't want to see in the classroom simply to avoid looking, quote unquote, dumb or stupid in front of their peers. And I say quote unquote because I've actually talked with students and they would say that. They would like, I would rather run out of the classroom than have my friends think I'm stupid. That is something that they want to avoid often. So we want to know the why behind that. And what are they trying to get when they are engaging in that behavior? One of the catchphrases that I often use when I'm talking with teachers is behavior is communication. When a child or a person is engaging in a behavior, they're trying to tell us something, and we need to listen. And as the adults, sometimes that means that we need to listen extra closely because the child can't tell us themselves. So we have to put our thinking hats on, put our professionalism on, and figure out what's going on with the student. When we do an FBA, we gather data from multiple places, from the teacher, direct observation of the student, school records, that full and individual evaluation, but we also try to get information from the parent because you have valuable insight into who your child is and what's going on with your child outside of the school. We don't have access to that information unless we ask you. So as a school psychologist, I beg you to please share some of that information with your team when they ask, because sometimes there are things going on outside of school that are really impacting a kiddo's ability to use their brain in school and learn because they're worried about things going on outside of school. And if we're aware of that, we can plan around that. We can work on coping strategies. But if we're not aware of that, it's going to be really hard for us to address the actual needs of the student. Once we collect all of that information, and again, hopefully you're sharing some information with us too about any changes going on at home, we want to use that to create the behavior intervention plan. That is the whole point of an FBA. And so we need to make sure that we have really good data for that FBA so that our BIP, our behavior intervention plan, is appropriate for that student. Once we have that BIP, we can start putting in place interventions. We can talk about strategies. We can talk about who's going to work on what. How are we going to make this make this interaction with other adults and other practitioners at school worth it for the kiddo to change their behavior? Because behavior change sometimes is not easy for our students. So we need to make sure that it's worth their time and their energy and their effort. So I talk a lot about that with teachers, but I won't go into that too much today. But the goal is we want them to be able to have the skills to positively interact with other people and the environment at school so that they can build good relationships and learn the academics that they need to learn. So many things are addressed in school that have nothing to do with math and reading. And sometimes things not related to math and reading prevent students from being able to learn. So we need to make sure that we are creating a plan that addresses all of those things. So now we're going to talk about the behavior intervention plan, really the point of today. But I needed to go over that FBA because if you go into that meeting and you say, we need a BIP, a behavior intervention plan, and your team says, okay, we need to do an FBA first, I want to make sure that you are equipped with the knowledge of what they're talking about and that it's a really good idea to do an FBA first. The law does not require an FBA to be completed prior to the creation of a BIP. It's not required, but it is best practice, and TEA will tell us that. So it's really important that if your team is saying, let's go ahead and put a BIP in place, but an FBA hasn't been completed yet, it's really important for you to just ask the question, why are we doing a BIP first? Sometimes it's because there's a behavior that everyone agrees this is why they are engaging in the behavior. For instance, if we have a student, again, struggling with reading and they're leaving the classroom anytime they're asked to read aloud, we can guess that maybe the reason they're engaging in that behavior is to get away from or avoid the task that's really anxiety producing and hard for them. A lot of times people will be like, that's why the child's engaging in that behavior. So we can just write a bit based off of that. That's not incorrect, but sometimes it's not that simple. And so we just need to be aware of that. We also have children and young adults in schools who unfortunately are struggling with some very scary and concerning behaviors. And so we may want to put a BIP in place while we're conducting that FBA to make sure that student and everyone else around them is safe at school. This is often what I would recommend if you have a student who is running out of the school building, who is engaging in physical aggression and things like that, simply because we want to make sure that even if we are doing in the midst of an evaluation, we're still providing a safe environment and we have a plan in place to address those needs. Okay, now let's really dive in. A behavior intervention plan is a plan. I know, surprising. It's literally in the title. But it's meant to be a very specific plan to allow us to target those concerning behaviors and develop a very systematic approach on how we're going to hopefully change that behavior and guide the student through making positive changes so that they can function at school and be a part of the school community without having to be removed for any concerning behavior. And again, this is based off of information from that functional behavior assessment, that FBA. So this plan, this BIP, may look a little bit different from school to school because the IEP systems we use, the computer systems we use to write our reports and create our documents can vary from district to district, but the components of the BIP should be very similar from district to district. We should see an identified target behavior or two, so a couple of behaviors that are really concerning. And we should be able to see what are the behaviors we do want to see. Those are called replacement behaviors. What are the behaviors we want the student to engage in? That's really important because if I'm saying I want the child to not run in the hallway, that's important for us as adults to know, but some of our students may not realize that, oh, the appropriate behavior is to walk in the hallway. And so if I'm observing a student and the teacher says, don't run in the hallway, and the student starts skipping, in my head, as a school psychologist, I'm like, technically, they complied, but we know as adults what we want the behavior to be. We don't want to assume that our students are always going to know. This is what I tell my teachers all the time. So we want to be able to tell them what they should be doing, what they need to be doing, what is the expectation for them. That is how we ensure that everyone is on the same page about what that behavior needs to look like. So we are going to have identified behaviors we need to work on, and then the behaviors that we want to see instead. And how do we get from point A to point Z? Well, we're also going to identify strategies that the teacher can use to prevent the behavior occurring. So these could be things like before you go into the hallway, remind the class, hey, we walk in the hallway. Don't forget, we use walking feet in the hallway. That is warning ahead of time. That's a great strategy to use. Sometimes we will use pictures as reminders. Sometimes we will give individual reminders to students, right? So, what are some strategies that teachers can use to prevent the behavior? At the same time, we also want to work directly with the student to develop skills and coping strategies to be able to prevent their own behavior. So, for instance, if I have a child that struggles with frustration and gets very frustrated and upset when things are really hard for them, I might work with them on being able to identify what happens before they blow up in a way, before it gets really bad. So I may start with identifying feelings. I may start with identifying what does their body do. I had a kiddo who said, oh, my hands get really wet and then I have to wipe them on my jeans all the time. I'm like, oh, so your hands start sweating when you start to get a little anxious or you are unsure about a situation. Is that what you mean? And he's like, yes, that's what I mean. Great. So if that starts happening, if your palms start sweating, that's when you have to say, oh, when my palms sweat, that means I'm starting to get nervous or I'm starting to get frustrated or I'm not liking the situation I'm in. That's a good time to utilize one of my strategies that I learned, asking for help, asking for a break. It could be counting to 10, taking deep breaths, any of those things could be a strategy that a child could use. We just have to make sure that we're teaching our students those strategies if that's an area of need. We also need to have, as part of a plan, what happens if that student does engage in the behavior we don't want to see? How should the teacher and staff respond? And then we want to make sure that if a child is engaging in behavior that is a danger to themselves or others, there's a safety plan in place. And that's really critical. Depending on the age and the skills of the student, I will often encourage people to use what we call reinforcement inventories and interviews with children to find out what are things that they enjoy and what are things that they will work towards. When we have children who have to change their behavior, they will struggle with engaging in the process of changing that behavior if they aren't getting something out of it. Okay. And that's normal human behavior. I go to work because I want a paycheck. You go to work because you want a paycheck. I have kids who will do so many things if I give them talkies, right? And so if they are going to be engaging in hard work, we want to make sure that it's worth it to them. So I will have, as part of the BIPs that I help create, plans with my teachers. Okay, if you see the child trying to engage in the behavior that we do want to see, how are we going to acknowledge that? Don't ignore the effort of the child because it's really hard to change behaviors that you've been engaging in for a while. And so I always encourage them to have a plan on how to reinforce that behavior and acknowledge that behavior. And that will definitely vary from student to student depending on interest, age, behavior. And then we also need a plan on how we're going to track, is this working? And that's usually going to be tied to those goals that you're going to have. So you'll have behavior goals in that IEP to address those things. So what do I really want you to take away from today's Training? Well, number one, please be open and honest with your team to make sure that they are aware of any changes that are happening at home. Be an active participant in the conversation when you're talking about the needs of your kiddo. What are their interests? What are things that actually make them more upset? And make sure that you are asking questions if you're unsure about what's going on in that meeting. It's really impactful for that student long term to know that their parent is advocating for their needs and is involved in their education. And even if that's just asking questions and actively listening to the staff that's working with your student, that goes a long way in ensuring that your child has a good future ahead of them. We want to collaborate with our parents as much as possible because, again, they're your babies. You're the expert on your kiddo. And if you don't know the answer and we don't know the answer, then we want to work together to figure those things out. There are so many opportunities where miscommunication can happen. So please be very mindful of reaching out to your staff if you haven't heard from your teachers in a while. Don't be afraid to ask those questions. Don't be afraid to seek more information simply because that's going to be much better for you and your child in the long run.